All right, welcome to the 11th workshop in the Return to Freud. In this workshop series, we are returning to the original Freudian texts, trying to analyze them in detail, and then discussing their relevance and their context for our contemporary intellectual and personal life, related to modern science, related to modern problems of spirituality and just sort of seeing what the foundations of Freud have to teach us today. So with that context, in the 11th workshop, we're going to be going into two papers, one from 1909 and one from 1910. The first paper from 1909 is on family romances, and the second paper from 1910 is a paper about choice of romantic object by men. And that specific paper is a paper in a series of papers, a trilogy of papers, you might say, on the psychology of love. And I plan in future workshops to complete that little trilogy on the psychology of love, probably in the next workshop. So look out for that and see that as a logical continuation of this workshop. I'm just going to share my screen and we'll start analyzing the first paper. Just a sec. Share screen. All right, so the first paper is on family romances. And here Freud, starts to play around, and this is, I think, the first paper really where we're going to start to encounter some ideas that many of you will be familiar with in the context of the Oedipal complex and how the Oedipal complex comes to be an important factor in the development of psychoanalytic knowledge and Freudian theory specifically. Family romances. So the paper starts off with Freud's idea here that liberation from parental authority is one of the most necessary and one of the most painful aspects of an individual's development. And the reason being is, which makes sense from the point of view of development of the unconscious, which is that parents are a huge source of belief and idealization of the child. Of course, this might be extended to any older adult figures that the child is exposed to in the early years of life, mainly because from the point of view of the child, the adults appear fully formed. The adults appear fully developed, and the source of what the child knows about the world and about society. He also says that in the development of individuals, the opposition between different generations, the younger, middle-aged, and older generations, is fundamental for social progress. And I think that this is an important thing to consider in our lives and today, because one of the most fundamental sort of differences perhaps between our time and Freud's time is that the different generations are often isolated from one another. It wouldn't be uncommon in the past for a house to contain all the different generations at the same time. Infants, middle-aged, and older people, and that the community was sort of connected intergenerationally. Not so normal in our time, or not as common in our time. He then introduces a distinction which he plays with in all of his early papers, and we've probably come to be extremely familiar with this distinction, which is the distinction between normal adults and neurotic adults, a distinction which Freud himself plays with and is in some sense critical and deconstructive of throughout his own intellectual development. But nonetheless, a distinction that is useful in the context of early psychoanalytic theory, since the early patients Freud is working with are oftentimes extremely neurotic individuals. And introduces this distinction that so-called normal adults are those adults who have overcome or liberated themselves from parental authority, and in some sense from idealization of parents, idealization of the mother, idealization of the father. Whereas neurotic adults seem to have a stronger problem or a more difficulty overcoming idealization of parents, um, fail to liberate themselves from unconscious ideas about the father and the mother. Um, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, but more just a thing. And that neurotics in particular seem to be more imaginative than normal adults. And that as a consequence of that, it could simply be that neurotics simply struggle with more intense ideation, more intense idealization than normal adults. So what Freud suggests as universal in all children, irrespective of whether or not the adult becomes neurotic, is that the child has a extremely intense wish. And of course, the wish and the wish fulfillment is fundamental to the unconscious in Freudian theory. And this wish is to be like his or her same-sex parent as expressed in play. Um, you might even say that this is simply the child's growing up dream, the dream of when I grow up, I want to be like mom, or when I grow up, I want to be like dad. And that there's an extremely uncomfortable feeling in the child. Uh, and this, Freud suggests, is where the neuroses start to become manifest. This neurotic feeling that one is not getting the whole of one's parents' love, the mother or the father. And this provokes extreme dissatisfaction and critique of the parent. This feeling like mom or dad their attention is elsewhere, their love is elsewhere. And of course, as adults, their love by nature is distributed throughout many different people. But the child experiences this as wrongdoing. The child experiences this as offensive, as an injustice, even. And it's interesting that he doesn't then tell us more about specifically how girls might develop hostile impulses towards the father and the mother. He specifically mentions boys. This might be because, and connected to the next paper, that he is specifically interested at this part in his career in kind of the object choice made by men, as we'll get to in the next paper. But as it relates to the boy, that if there is this sort of extreme dissatisfaction that you're not getting the whole of your father's attention, that the boy can develop extremely hostile impulses towards the father. And these hostile impulses are a feeling of ingratitude, a lack of gratefulness, a feeling that one needs to develop freedom away from the father. And also, and connected apparently to this development of hostile impulses, also the invention of fictitious fantasies about the mother, specifically her faithlessness in sexuality, that her sexuality as distant from him, or her sexuality as a weapon against him, a revenge and a retaliation. So this double fantasy here that develops in the neurotic's mind, specifically in this part, the boys' side, I'm pretty sure that this might develop also for the girl, maybe in different ways. But I know that these hostile impulses and invention of fictitious fantasies about the mother, or a woman in general, have quite widespread transference processes in general. We might get into that a little bit as well, about how these childlike impulses towards the father and the mother can be also imaginative structures which present themselves in our romantic relationships and which present themselves in our perhaps work life, other modes of idealization of older men and older women. So this neurotic family romance one develops of hostility towards the father and a sort of faithlessness towards the mother is, according to Freud, seldom remembered consciously, but rather something that's revealed in analysis as crucial for the neurotic. And they manifest in daydreams. And this is a very nice connection with previous workshops on daydreams, specifically the erotic and ambitious bifurcation of daydreams, which, as we've already covered, are aimed at quote unquote correcting reality. Dissatisfaction with reality is a common theme in early psychoanalytic theory and psychoanalytic theory in general. And the most interesting dimension of these daydreams is that what is originally experienced in childhood of a hostility towards the father and a type of playing with a faithlessness of the mother become, as it were, transferred onto higher social status others. So, for example, you might play out unconsciously hostility towards an older man who is particularly successful, a man that you might be idealizing strongly. Your early childhood fantasies of the father might dramatize themselves here. In the same way with the erotic or sexual nature of women, a woman that you're idealizing, you may fantasize about her as being faithless. You might romanticize or start to imagine that she is, as it were, giving her sexuality to another man, giving herself to another man instead of you. And this whole process, according to Freud, is an unconscious fantasy wish stimulated by the dissatisfaction of reality itself, of a better birth, wishing that you had been born in better circumstances. How far we want to take this theory, how far we want to take this idea that the unconscious fantasizes about a better birth could be even to the fundamental structure of reality itself. This fantasy wish that reality itself is dissatisfactory, that the very nature of our sexuality or the very nature of being man or woman, being something of a substitute for a higher satisfaction, which has been, at least unconsciously perceived as forbidden or unavailable to us. So, as the neurotic develops, according to Freud, and as the neurotic discovers this unconscious structure in their own mind, there's an interesting double pattern that emerges, this idea that the father is somehow more uncertain than the mother, that the mother is more certain, specifically as related to maternal origin, that that one can, as it were, sort of be sure or be certain that one comes from the mother, and that the hostility towards the father was really a desire to exalt the father, to put the father on a pedestal. And the more this is brought to consciousness, seemingly, the more the idealization points towards, and I think this is really interesting, that what the idealization has been pointing towards is basically the setting of a stage for the emergence of a hero to, as it were, legitimize his own or her own birth and social standing. That the ingratitude towards the father and the faithless fantasies of the mother are only an appearance, but that deep down, what's going on is that the individual subject in their development is trying to find, and I think this is interesting stated in the paper, almost that the subject is trying to become their own cause, trying to become their own origin. And in this, the sort of unconscious dynamics of the father and the mother in the development were a type of challenge or a type of mystery that were difficult for the subject to piece together on its own. But this setting of the stage for the emergence of a hero, which I think we're going to get into. Well, this is the final page of this paper. So he says the whole effort of the neurotic imagination, and remember back to the distinction that the neurotic, apparently has a stronger imagination than a quote unquote normal adult, but that the neurotic's imagination was trying to reclaim this feeling in early childhood of a strong father and a lovely mother. And this pushing it back even further, I think you could push this back to a reclaiming of the self as self-caused, being one's own cause, being strong and lovely, you might say. For the subject to feel that to overcome the feeling of unconscious impotence, or to overcome the feeling of hate, of ingratitude, of all of these deep emotional woundings and struggles. In the dream, it's interesting to note, and this is against a theme in Freud's early writings, which perhaps are not emphasized as much as they should. But the idea that the king and the queen, the emperor and the empress, stand for the father and the mother in the dream. This idea, very strong, I think, among lovers, of being king or queen, of labeling the other, the sexual other, as a royal, giving the other a royal designation, is related to this fantasy of the very strong father and the very lovely mother. And he even concludes here, like I was suggesting in the beginning, that this distinction between the neurotic and the healthy adult or the normal adult is a distinction which Freud is always, as it were, playing with, but simultaneously problematizing, in the sense that really here he's identifying an extreme deviation in the neurotic, which is in fact expressed in all minds. So all minds here have this tendency or this capacity to, as it were, struggle with intensity of idealization, struggle to situate the intensity of this idealization as it relates to the position of the subject in sexual difference, as it relates to the position of the subject as a developmental process. And that is, I think, the conclusion of this paper, and where we might open up discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing. I just want to say, to preface, the having a conversation about this, I certainly, as in all of these papers, it's remarkably helpful for my own reflection on self, specifically as it relates to, this feeling of hostility towards older, successful men that I'm idealizing, and specifically in relationship to my own sexual fantasies with women, of the this tendency to imagine that the woman is getting a better sexual enjoyment elsewhere. It's totally fictitious in my mind, potentially, not necessarily an actual reality, but nonetheless one that is extremely strong and intense. This idea that there's something better elsewhere, and that she's getting it elsewhere, and that's very I think important to realize what these intense idealizations are actually trying to claim or reclaim. So
yeah, it's really intense stuff, really.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. The
one cannot
intensity of the
really,
ideal.
one cannot really read this kind of consideration without having some kind of like reaction of remembering one's own development, the way that one relates to sexuality and everything in this area and so.
Absolutely. I think that this
Yeah.
is, you know, every time we dive into these papers, I just get a deeper and deeper conceptual aid in
Yeah.
self discovery.
Yeah. I found it quite interesting that well, Freud notices that one might be really inclined to recoil from hearing the kind of things that he is saying there. So I find it really uh, admirable that he is still preserving the kind of like sensitivity towards the person who is not really familiar with the view that he is developing here. So he's really sensitive to how his own view is received, but he's also really incredibly brave when he is saying what he is saying, since it's really adventurous. And I think, as I have already said before, that his genius lies in overcoming certain internal obstacle when considering these things, and in a way he is able to preserve objective uh, attitude towards the material that comes up when focusing on issues of sexuality.
Yeah, that has actually stuck in my mind. I remember in the early workshops you mentioned that how Freud's genius involves, you know, simply this willingness to enter a type of endless self-critique or an endless self-observation where you are willing to dive into potentially painful, potentially disturbing truths. And I think that, you know, that theme in particular is coming up for me in academia and academic context in general, which is it's, and actually this was mentioned in a recent YouTube, not it's 2017, but a recent presentation that's available on YouTube with Slavoj Žižek talking about the return of Freud and psychoanalytic theory, being that it's not so much that psychoanalytic theory is difficult to grasp or even the method of free association as difficult to implement. It's more that it's painful, potentially,
Yeah.
and that one has to go through a few internal obstacles or internal resistances, and that if the subject is not willing to go through those processes, then it kind of is irrelevant how intelligent you are. You could
Yeah,
be
yeah.
the most intelligent person in the world and still resist all of this emotional weight.
In a way, one has to observe the emotional reaction and be sensitive to it, but simultaneously not be overcome with hysterical reaction to it.
Mm-hmm.
One has to really observe and listen to the kind of like hysterical reaction that comes up. And when I picture somebody who has really like antagonistic relations to Freud, I think that they might have some kind of like recognition of their own issue that they are not really, probably never going to be brave enough to face.
Absolutely. It's an interesting anecdote that in the context of my, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but in the context of my own doctoral dissertation process, my supervisor and I had an antagonistic relationship, and of all the theorists that I explored, the resistance to Freud was markedly intense. You know, like
Yeah.
for some reason, but there's a certain resistance provoked by Freud, a certain hatred provoked, which seems to me irrational to an extreme degree in the context of the rest of theory as a whole.
I would like to say something, Kader.
Sure.
Thank you so
Welcome.
much that you, my English is not so good, but that you remembered me about how painful this process of becoming an adult is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very easy to stay as a child, but for becoming an adult, this implies pain and being able to face some frustration and some lack and gap.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's a very important concept that makes me think on Lacan, this gap, this lack.
Mm-hmm.
So the parents are not perfect anymore. They are not a totality anymore. They are incomplete. And I think because we are talking about this text, I think Winnicott, Donald Winnicott brought a very important concept, the good enough mother.
Mm-hmm.
Because this good enough mother of Winnicott is a mother that is able to make this fortda process in a not very traumatic way, but also giving the possibility to the child to face this gap step by step, to face this lack, to face this fault, this not being present of the mother, and then again being present. So this pendulating movement. And this is very important because if the mother is like a crocodile, like a very possessive and too much attached mother, then the child is suffocated.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
I was also thinking of Lacan in the very first lines, since when Freud says that the liberation of individual is gained from separation from family, I was thinking of emergence of subject in Lacan, where it is something that presupposes castration. And one can think of introduction into world, or introduction to language, and introduction to a larger context as this move of castration from initial substance to subjectivity, in also Hegelian terms, from substance to subject. But it's I think really relatable issue that for any kind of like individual development to occur, there has to be a separation from the family life first. And I don't think I can personally think of people who might be even in their 60s and still be tormented by figures of parents of overly punitive or maybe too liberal, or whatever the problem is with parents, even in like older people.
I think that it's interesting to connect this, certainly people can be tormented by figures of the parents up to the end of life. Because it doesn't matter the time, almost, because it's more this distinction about this willingness to face some lack or gap and the frustration involved, which is involved in the overcoming of the idealization, because the idealization could just persist indefinitely. And this I think that it's important to emphasize that the lack can operate in a paradoxical two ways, where you could feel like my father or mother were not present, they were lacking. Alternatively, I think that the father and the mother can be overly present, too much, and that the reaction of the subject to both extremes can be extremely disturbing. Like a parent who gives their child too much, the child can have a very vicious reaction against that. And I'm almost tempted to share one of the most devastating stories I've ever heard about this giving too much and the risk involved in giving too much, which I think is worth sharing very quickly. This story of a man child, basically, who was given everything by his parents, room, accommodation, funding for his university, everything was given. And his reaction when the possibility that anything might be removed from him by his parents was that he killed them in an attempt to reclaim the money he would get from their death. So if you give too much to the child, they'll respond in an extremely violent potential way. So I think it's important to be aware of both possibilities: the lack as absence, the lack as overpresence.
Yeah, the only good father is a dead father.
And then there's that saying, right, about the hero, is that you become, what is it? You die the hero, or you live long enough to become the villain. Like those are the two options. I think that was in The Dark Knight. But
yeah. The best father is always the villain.
Yeah. It seems like an impossible job.
Well, this is at least what Zizek is saying, that there is no way, that he's saying that the clinical lesson from Freud is that there is no purely like healthy way of being a parent. A parent is always toxic, in a sense.
Yeah, it's almost like the problem of birth. Like I keep getting these images that there's something about the subject. It's like fundamentally something about the subject which sees it as an injustice that it was born. Almost that it should be something that has no cause, that exists without birth, that exists without death, that has a self cause, that it's its own cause. Like it's almost as humiliating that it has parents.
Yeah, there's always some kind of like libidinal dirt going on. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's the assertion of I'm alive, right? To say I decided this.
Right, yeah.
It's
yeah,
to choose,
say,
like to
I
say
choose it to be so.
I chose to be born.
Yeah. And this fantasy is very common. I've met so many people, especially in spiritual circles, that have the metaphysical structure or the metaphysical presupposition that the soul chooses its body, that there's something about your parents that you chose this constellation of. Now, I say nothing about the truth or the falseness of this claim, merely that there are subjects that strongly believe that they chose their body.
Would that be
this desire.
So would that be like the ultimate fantasy of liberalism, in a sense?
Right. I would situate these metaphysical fantasies within the libidinal economy of liberalism. Like where
I'm reading,
I, as an individual.
Yeah, I'm reading Freud's comments at the end of this paper as saying that there is this sort of like irony of dialectics going on when he's discussing the way that children start to fantasize about having a better upbringing or having had a better way of having brought up. This is some kind of like libidinal stain that always stays with us, some kind of like toxic character of our own sexual life. Yeah, so Freud is saying that when one is imagining a better set of parents for oneself, they are always derived from the early recollections of the actual humble ones that one had. And only in the later stage, when one starts to recognize them as lacking, then one starts to pick out the kind of like parts from other parents and starts to sort of like try to attach them to one's own to constitute the new and the better ones. But the irony of like this whole thing is that we are not free in this activity, since we are always attached to our original parents when we try to replace them. It's a dialectical reversal that I see Freud's points being here at the end. So like trying to replace the real father by a superior one is just expression of this longing of a happy days and the early years when one was like exalting them already.
Alexandra?
Yes, because you raised this problem, I would like to add that it would be interesting to talk a little about the ontology of the subject, because you said individual, but in the same time, etymologically, in this word individual, we have in and individual. Also, we can think about dividual, or as René Girard said, interdividual, because Lacan comes after Freud and brings this split of the subject. So that's a question, the ontological status of the subject. So
absolutely.
Is it autonomous, individual, like in liberal paradigm, or it's non-dual in the sense that there is a unique intersubjective relation to his mother, to his father? He's not separated. He is, in a way, by mimicry, by mimesis, imitating and becoming a subject that is not autonomous, that is like having its roots in the other. So I am the other. So for me, it's not clear the ontological status of the subject in psychoanalysis.
Well, as it relates to I as an other, I think Lacan is, explicit that I is an other. He grounds his whole theory of the subject as I equals other, basically. That there's no way to sort of, as it were, ground the I in some self-substance or something like that. That the like the res cognitant or something like that. The cognitive substance. That the I is always a mediation of others, and this is how I understand it: is the I is a mediation of others, and that the problem is the lacking other with a big O. That there's no big O, there's no big other that can, as it were, hold me. Like, the fantasy of the womb here comes to my mind. But this ontological status of the subject is this gaping hole, this wound, this like the I think Zizek always says the wound or something, the wound the subject tries to heal is the subject itself. I think about this as it relates to, say, for example, addiction. Like if I really want to fill a hole, with whatever it is, the certain substance, that the very process of me experiencing myself as lacking is my own spiritual mediation of self.
So the I is an other, but that's not the big other.
So again, I think this is just how I understand. I'm not saying it's the way to understand it, but this is how I've articulated it to myself: is the I is constantly mediated by others, meaning that, like as soon as you come out of the womb, there's a mother. As soon as you come out of the womb, there's other beings, and you're a mediation of these others. And then the problem the subject experiences on an intense emotional level is that there isn't an other with a big O, as it were, that could take away all the little others. Like, traditionally this would be God. Think about how people live their entire life for God. This is living one's entire life for the big other, for some other that would hold me, that I could pray to, that I could speak to, that I could have some intimate connection with.
Isn't this topic of the self as other? Yeah, it's a good question. Is it a big other? Since the big other is, as far as I understand, it's always relating to a symbolic structure which precedes subjectivity. But isn't the way that Zizek is trying to think of subjects, I mean, the very logical sense of being a subject, that I am supposed to be like free, autonomous, singular being, and the fact that there are other subjects in my experience, this bothers me tremendously. Like, there shouldn't be other subjects. I should be like, logically, I should be a subject that is autonomous, unique, but in fact there are others also. Yeah. So this propels into the kind of topic of Hegelian becoming and so on in like enculturation and formations.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Doesn't I is another also refer to a divided subject, a split subject, like self-alienation, or maybe the subject of enunciation and the subject of enunciated difference? I mean, like me that can never be myself, this division. Maybe we can read it like this as well. That's how I more read it. This I is another. So there is something in me.
Well, I as another is divided subject. I as another is like, because it's a paradox, right? I as another is a paradox.
And like this paradox, like I am lying. I mean, this is a paradox. I am lying. So this grammatical I is different than the other I that is expressing, enunciating this. So otherwise there would be a paradox, as you put it.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely understand I as another as this split subject, and also self-alienation as a positive thing. Like that, I had this conversation with a friend over the summer break that alienation is, something that's almost a privilege, to be alienated. And to go deeper into alienation, to me, that's the alien otherness. That's your own capacity to be different, your own capacity to become, is this ownership of self-alienation.
Zizek develops this alien as neighbor. So at this point, we are also neighbor to ourselves as well at some point.
Absolutely. That's Lacan's critique of Freud. Well, and the play on, sort of love and the neighbor, that to love one's own alien neighbor.
Yeah. Or even when someone is very close to you, your sister, your brother, your son, and someday you see something and about this person that you think that you know him or her, and you are totally shocked, like you get alienated to this person. So neighbor is not somebody that is away, but very close to us, that shocks us.
This is a very good point. I think it also comes up in romantic relationships that it's very traumatic for people to be so close to another, and at the same time to deal with the fact that there's something about your neighbor, your love partner, that will always be alien, that you'll never really be able to know. There'll always be a distance.
Yes, this this radical otherness.
Yes.
And also we can talk about the stranger in me. Inside me, there is a stranger.
Yes.
And this has to do with unconscious level.
Absolutely.
And with my identifications and the distance I'm able to take toward my identities. And to become flexible, to change.
Yeah, I think that this example also that Everin was giving of, someone you're very close to acts in a way that creates this realization of the alien otherness. I think it's also important to realize that this can happen inside oneself. That inside oneself, you can observe something about yourself that takes yourself by surprise. Oh my goodness. So this is very interesting. And I almost feel like that's a really important part of self-development, is the capacity to encounter the alien within oneself and to become sensitive to it and to become inviting almost to it. And of course, that's a huge seat of potential repression of oneself, to deny, to push it away, or at least try to.
Isn't it also that, because I've experienced this, that your body is always acting out its unconscious theater, and sometimes if you're lucky you discover something about yourself and you're like, you're scared shitlessly, you're like, oh my god, this is who I am, I'm disgusted. And like, I think that this, let's call it a gesture of perceiving it, totally like cringing, feeling terrible, and like acknowledging it at the same time. Isn't this also going from the death drive to like libidinal repression of it? That you're like, this is not enough and I'm going beyond myself. I can't go along in this symptom anymore, so I have to transcend it. That's like, and then you can only change truly when you're disgusted by yourself.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that I definitely have my own relationship to this as well. This, especially the like the paradoxical coincidence of something cringy and disgusting and something fascinating and attractive. That the same thing that's cringy and disgusting can be fascinating and attractive at the same time. And yeah, for sure. And mechanics of libido, and you might say libido and mortido, mechanics of these two processes are at work here, almost certainly.
Yeah, because it's the death drive just goes into a cycle. So this cycle stops, you perceive it, and then you transcend it. I think it's a very libidinal gesture. That libido itself as this repression of mortido, or the death drive. And also something else I think I found very interesting about this I is an other is that Zizek talks about Bosnian women who are raped in the Yugoslav wars. And he said that they kept themselves alive by saying to themselves that after the war, I will tell my family, I will go to whoever, a big other figure, to tell this and tell the world what happened, the atrocities. And at the end of the war, their families didn't want to know about it. Nobody gave a shit, and they killed themselves. So if there's no big other whom we can say, please look at me, look what happened, the tragedy I am, then we kill ourselves.
Yeah, or potentially. We have. I think we always have a choice, but this story of the lacking other with the war and rape is a good example of something that can happen to all of us. This feeling of injustice, that there isn't an other that, as it were, can register, acknowledge my pain, think here about Catholicism and confession, where there is a type of simulation of a big other that would recognize, that would see, that would somehow this had a cleaning or a clearing function in the subject, that if I could go to the big other and open up about everything that's happened to me or my sins, that there would be some emotional effect that made it more bearable. Yeah, it's powerful, and I feel it in myself as well, for sure. You know, this feeling of this injustice at the lack of such an entity to set things right.
Excuse me, Kadel. What do you think? What makes the choice, this so-called ethical, maybe choice, or I don't know, to
Yeah,
say
this ethical,
yes?
I think it is ethical choice.
To say yes or no to the big other. Why? Why some people say yes to they open to the big other, and others are foreclosing, are rejecting the big other on a this is on a very subtle level. I think it's not rationality, it's not I don't know, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't have the answer to it. I think I just interject. Yeah, it's definitely an ethical choice that the subject has, and it has to do with, at least in my first reflection on it, has to do with sort of whether or not one can bear the reality of no other. Like if you say yes to life, then you're saying, I accept that there's no other that can recognize my deepest pain, and yet I still want to live. I still want to continue on. And then on the other hand, if someone says no, and feels burned that there is no other to register my pain, at least in myself, when I observe my unconscious with this dilemma, I perceive that there's something about the unconscious that says, all right, because there's no big other, I'll kill myself as a gesture to the big other. Like that my own death, my own self-sacrifice will almost be the redemption itself. Like, you should have been there for me, and now you're going to lose me. You know, like this type of thing, like almost like reality isn't good enough for me. It doesn't deserve me. That there's this type of dimension, you know, like of choice. I think it's about understanding the rationality of the unconscious, you know, like not my rationality as a, you know, as a conscious subject, but the rationality of the unconscious itself, you know, like the desire to kill oneself because there's no big other is almost this protest of the subject itself in the face of cold reality.
But do you think that for women, it's easier to surrender to the big other than for men, or not?
It could be. There could be sexual difference here.
I think so.
Well, it certainly could be. I was always interested in the sociological observation, I think made by Emil Durkheim, that men committed suicide at a higher rate than women. I don't know if that's still true, but certainly this possibility of surrender or not is potentially an interesting topic of sexual difference.
Maybe because we are like a Cora, we are like an emptiness, an empty space, something as Lacan said, la femme n'existe pas. We do not exist, as the woman does not exist. There is just a lack, an empty space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Zizek also says many times that man has this tendency to too strongly substantialize the emptiness. So facing the emptiness is much more difficult. It requires a different relation to one's own body, I think. I could say, Mika, did you want to say something?
Yeah, about the difference between men and women in relation to big other. I was thinking of the way that we preserve appearances. I mean, one of the like key lessons from Zizek's philosophy is that Stalinism and other regimes were really like the best evidence of the fact that the big other is necessary. That's the people in like Stalinism were all the time keeping up the appearances, even though everything was falling apart all the time. So this is what I was discussing with my own fiancé the other day. That's isn't the way that women and men relate to this keeping up the appearances despite all the troubles. It's really different in women, since women are more prone to repetition without any kind of like further aim than the repetition of the keeping up the appearances. So say when we are planning our wedding, it's really obvious that all the appearances that are put, the whole facade, how do you pronounce it, of having a big splash of like huge wedding with everything is in place, everything is enacted for some gaze of the other. It's really a woman's thing. Women really have to like keep up the appearances, even like despite all the troubles that come up. Like even if arranging the whole marriage scene is wholly ridiculous, you have to take like stupid pictures when you are preparing for coming to the altar. You have to take all these kind of stupid shits which are sold to women and men alike who just pretend to be enjoying it. But the idea of keeping up the appearances, this is the kind of like evidence of the big other, I think.
I think it's a great point. I can share that, like, for example, my aunt right now, I should say, because there are viewers who won't understand the context on channel, but my grandfather is passing away above my head, and my aunt is doing a fantastic job of maintaining the appearances. And her capacity to maintain the appearances, even in this situation, is something that I personally almost can't do. I need her there to help maintain the appearances. Otherwise, it's too much for me to bear. And this capacity, which I think has a remarkable quality to it in the women in my family, of this repetition without any further aim, my mother does it with Christmas, it has no symbolic significance to me at all anymore. And her capacity to maintain the appearance of Christmas, even in the lack of the old meaning, there's something phenomenal about it.
Yeah, it's tremendously like I think it's incredible how some people like can keep it up. Like it's not some kind of like illusion that we need to dispel with some manly like inquiries into the nature of existence. I mean, isn't the very like temptation of philosophy perverse in a sense, since we are trying to like uncover the reason why from the birth on we are doing certain things all the time. We are introduced to language, and then we are starting to philosophize, like know thyself. The Delphic oracle tells us we need to know the subject.
Although Lacan has the perfect critique of this, making fun of know thyself, like saying, but it's impossible, it's incomplete. Always.
It's great. So the kind of like insights that we get from like delving into philosophy from language is that ultimately there is no like ground. There is nothing that is providing the justification for why we are doing things. And this brings, for me at least, it brings certain kind of like melancholy. I mean, I have tremendous trouble sometimes motivating myself to doing things at all. Like, I first like experience things as compelling, I need to do things, then I start to write and think, why am I doing it? And then I find there is no reason for it. And then the whole thing dispels away. I mean, it's amazing how people can still keep up.
Isn't
Okay,
also the,
okay, man. Let's say I agree with what you were talking about, but I have a question. Do you see some points? Do you see some quality in this maintaining of a ritual, in this wonderful capacity of the woman to make this ritual again and again? Does this have a meaning for you?
Well, meaning is a technical term, but there is certainly value, yeah.
Why is she doing this? What is good in this?
What is good? Well, we need to be specific. What would be the good example of this type of action? I mean, there are many kind of things that I see no value in, like keeping up. But this is a like leftist like side of myself. I would personally be happy to like demolish a lot of things that we are doing, but certain things are very valuable, even if I cannot explain why I'm doing it.
Because I think there is a caring dimension in this rituals.
Yes,
it's about caring and about continuing something, about offering a space, about containing something.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah, I think there's that certainly that rings true for me. Is the caring dimension of these rituals is what holds things together, and without this repetition with no seeming aim other than the care itself, without it, everything would just fall apart. You know, so it's at least that's my own personal experience of it. So, really interesting discussion. I think we should move on to the next paper though, because we've got about an hour left. So I will share my screen again and get into the next paper. All right, so choice of object made by men. Really interesting paper, and the first, as I mentioned at the beginning, the first paper in a series of papers, which might be a type of trilogy on the psychology of love. So again, and this is a connection to a previous paper we've covered, Freud is interested in creative writers and their capacity to, as it were, sublimate the imagination that sometimes pathologizes neurotics, and suggests that the creative writer expresses in a remarkable way the demand of the unconscious to bring idealization into harmony with reality, and that their capacity to do this involves a higher level of sensitivity, and that their capacity to do this also involves the ability to read, as it were, the impulses of others, the motivations of others, and also the courage to let the unconscious speak. And I think that this sort of triad of interesting features of the creative writer is worth reflecting on deeply. The triad of higher sensitivity, the capacity to understand motivation, and the courage to speak the unconscious. However, he does say that the downside of the creative writer is that they use a type of poetic license to distort and remove certain disturbing elements that are involved in the reality of lovers, involved in the reality of the origin and the development of lovemaking. We can, I think, all relate to this in some way, because oftentimes a traditional love story will sort of end in a happily ever after type of way, which does not capture sort of the darker side of real love affairs and so forth. He then suggests that we're going to try to understand the love object. We're going to understand the choices of romantic partner, specifically made by men, using the psychoanalytic object, namely how neurotics behave in love. And that, for Freud, gets at the lack in creative writers, where they will use the poetic license again to remove some of this disturbing reality, sort of to analyze it in greater detail. And I also I think it's worth mentioning that Freud suggests that science as a method, he describes science as a method as the most complete renunciation of the pleasure principle. So you can see here that Freud sees psychoanalysis really as a continuation of science, sees psychoanalysis as a method of renunciation of the pleasure principle, and to confront potentially disturbing truths. So as it relates to the object choice in neurotic men, he suggests that there are a few necessary conditions for love in the neurotic. The first condition is that there must be an injured third party, namely that the woman is already attached or is already possessed by another man. The second is that the woman must be of quote unquote bad sexual reputation, that namely relating to fidelity, namely related to putting her sexual reputation in doubt. The classical distinction here between the good woman and the prostitute, or the virgin and the prostitute, the Madonna whore complex. Basically, Freud saying that the neurotic struggles immensely with this distinction between the virgin, the virgin woman and the prostitute. Third, the triangular situation between the injured third party and the prostitute woman becomes a focus of extremely high mental expenditure, namely that the neurotic man obsesses endlessly about the situation, obsesses endlessly about the nature of this social drama. And that what emerges from this obsession, what emerges from, you might say, this impossibility, is an urge to rescue the woman they love, an urge to specifically rescue her from her own potential moral decay and her own potential fall from social standing, and so forth. So these four conditions of love for the neurotic obviously challenge the idea that, or challenge the possibility that the man could fall into a type of normal monogamous pair bond leading to marriage and children. Another interesting dimension is that in the speech of the neurotic, there's this desire that the love relationship that is concentrating all this attention would complete his entire erotic life, but that in actual reality, these passionate attachments, these very strange triangular situations where the neurotic finds himself obsessing over a woman who he can't have and can't possess and who seemingly needs to be rescued, simply repeat as a endless series of passionate attachments of this nature. So the features of an injured party, the features of a woman with a questionable sexual history, the features of an intense fixation and an urge to rescue, Freud suggests here all have a single origin, which is discovered in a psychoanalysis, that of the neurotic struggling with feelings of the mother, the neurotic struggling with feelings of reunification with the mother, and struggling with the impossibility of this feat. That these features of neurotic love object are more powerfully expressed in neurotics, but also expressed universally. So again, this distinction between the healthy and the neurotic individual falling away, and simply the neurotic being a more extreme manifestation of something that is actually expressed and experienced in all of us. So his conclusion here is that this whole triangular situation and the fixation on this impossible situation is stamped with quote unquote maternal characteristics, and is functioning for the neurotic man as a mother surrogate. You go deeper into this. So the connection to the mother origin, why would these features, why would these particular characteristics of the neurotic love be connected to the mother origin? The interesting thing is that the injured third party for Freud is related to the fact of the child's own traumatic disturbance in the idea that the mother originally belonged to the father, and that upon discovering that the mother belonged to the father, this fact that the mother is owned by the father, so to speak, becomes inseparable from the mother's essence, that the mother gets her essence, as it were, from being owned by the father, and that it becomes a secret pleasure for the child. An interesting psychological dimension here, that there's a secret pressure inside the psychology of the child, that the child wants to disclose or reveal this essential relationship, but as it were, always keeps it hidden, always keeps it as a type of secret knowledge for himself. The second dimension, why would it be that the woman has to have a quote unquote questionable sexual history, or what we call a prostitute woman, is that this represents the trauma in the child of calling the mother's purity into question. This idea of the virgin prostitute split within the same subject. Because as we all know, and I think many of us, certainly I had this experience, the idea that our parents could have sex, or the idea that our parents are sexual beings with a life of their own, is something that the child finds, to say the least, uncomfortable. And that the idea that the mother would give sex to the father is something that the child sees as unfaithful, sees as crossing a boundary, as not giving the whole of one's love to the child. And consequently starts to see the father, or starts to see older masculine figures, as sexual rivals. And finally, and I think this is very interesting, that these fantasies of the mother having sex with someone else, these fantasies of the father as some rival of a sexual nature, find solidification and relief in a fixated quality in acts of masturbation. So acts of masturbation, especially in the neurotic individual, being types of revenge fantasies, acts of masturbation as being the place where the subject dramatizes this weird triangular situation of a woman who, as it were, is possessed by another man. Even think about the modern pornography industry, where many men will watch pornography fantasizing about another man taking a woman, but not themselves taking the woman. So this weird neurotic sexual fixation here, I think, becomes dramatized in a very strange way in the modern virtual landscape. So the neurotic fantasies get further solidified, get further amplified, even to the point of crossing over into the actual man's love life, due to the masturbatory repetition. That the masturbatory relief and the fantasies which stimulate this relief become, as it were, psychologically dominant and manifested in their real social relationships. So the fantasy of rescuing or, as it were, displacing the man that owns the woman can become, as it were, and a continuation of our previous conversation about how this can become displaced onto not the father, but other great men or other men of high social status. And finally, and this is also related to our conversation about the subject wanting to be its own cause, that all of these neurotic fantasies, all of these neurotic struggles have to do with the child trying to be his own cause, or in Freud's term, the single wish to, quote unquote, be his own father. So the fact that he was not the one, to, as it were, impregnate his mother, the fact that he was not the one to give birth to himself, ultimately, is the core of this weird neurotic pattern in the psychology of many men. So I will end here and stop sharing my screen, and we can open up. So I can say again, from my personal experience, when I sort of deviated, as it were, from the traditional monogamous relationship, I found myself in many situations that actually resemble quite strongly and quite disturbingly this neurotic love pattern of pursuing women or wanting to sort of obsess about certain social relationships that had the quality of an impossibility, had the quality of I'll never be able to own or possess this woman, but nonetheless, I have to be with this woman somehow. So like all the papers, very interesting for self-reflection.
Definitely, yes. And I was also thinking of my own love life when reading it, and I'm interested in whether we can, in a certain sense, distinguish between the kind of like serial lover, or perhaps in a certain way the kind of pickup artist or the Don Juan type, and then the kind of experience of falling in love. Is there some type of difference here? And I think there is, in a sense, but it gets really difficult when we recognize that in a certain way all like love is, in a sense, the search of the surrogate for the original love object, which is the mother. If we take like really literally, it's a kind of Freudian picture where our own love life becomes organized from this original object onwards in a certain way, in a continuation. But the way I experienced falling in love, it's definitely the way that Zizek says, that it's a catastrophe and there is nothing you can do about it. And it's something that you do not choose. I mean, it's so stupid that we have these tropes of persons who ask, why do you love me? What's the kind of like, I mean, all the dating guides who are saying that this is the kind of like object that you fall in love with. This is the property. This is blah, blah, blah. You know, this type of like action, the huge market for it and everything. But the way that love really experienced, it's something that's tragic, and it's just happened already, and you only can recognize it. I can say that when I fell in love, I knew that I was in love only when I experienced tremendous and tormenting jealousy about her. I mean, I was in constant pain about the idea that somebody might have her, and I couldn't handle it. But I also have been involved in this kind of like searching for the surrogates, and I know that there is a difference when we are searching for the kind of mother surrogate that always fails and necessarily fails. since we try to keep up the kind of action. And this is what I see in like the pickup artists. They are searching for the surrogate, and it always necessarily fails. And I have heard many of like pickup artists in videos say that, oh, they are just waiting for the perfect one, and when they know, they will recognize, and then they so on. You know, when they are waiting for some kind of like perfect match, but in a way they are searching for the original, like, well, mother.
I have a question about the injured third party. So who is injured here? Is it the mother, and because she is injured by the father, we have to rescue her? Or
I interpreted the injured third party to be the man who possesses the woman in the triangular situation. So like that person would have to suffer if the woman was actually to leave him for the neurotic subject. Like the third party would be, the woman is already possessed and attached to another man. So that person would have to be, as it were, injured to resolve the situation, which wouldn't be a resolution, because as in the sort of paper, Freud suggests, and the opposite of Mika's expression of that the neurotic subject doesn't even deep down want to possess the woman who is with the injured third party.
I would say that the third.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Mika.
It's really, in a sense, troubles with one's own father. That's the third party.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really the paternal figure. That's the. And I would think that's when somebody is in this serial relation, maybe they do fall in love, but they have really too much trouble handling their own emotions when it comes up. So they cannot, like, well, this is the cliche. You have to like be able to first know yourself and love yourself and have a stable life so that you can love one another and so on. I think it's something that hits my experience, that you have to have some kind of like stable experience and so on before you can really go into love relations.
So we have to transcend to wanting to kill the father. We have to transcend this.
Wanting to kill, well, like, to me it's to, and this is sort of like the end of the paper as well, where he suggests that what's really going on is, and this is related to what Mika was saying, what's really going on is this trouble of, how do I become the father? Like, how could I possibly become the father? And what the neurotic is doing in this weird triangle is delaying, this is my interpretation of it, and again, from also analyzing myself, is delaying confrontation with becoming the father. And you delay confrontation with becoming the father through this weird triangular relationship, because you're never going to actually be able to have this woman. You don't even want that woman. You're just sort of, as it were, maintaining a weird situation which you can fixate on. And you don't understand the unconscious motive is that you are struggling with the idea of becoming the father.
There's also the kind of like scheme where in the earliest, happiest era of the child, if we are with Freud, the child observes that somebody else has already a mother, namely father. And when the infant sees that the love is sort of unfairly given to the father, this gives rise to the kind of like primitive fantasy of having a revenge against the father. And this, after later, like pubertal stages where sexual orientation becomes more crucial to the psyche, then it becomes this kind of like searching for the kind of injured third party, but it always relates to the original scene or original fantasies.
And it's also interesting that in this searching for the original scene and so forth, that the idea that the mother is getting her essence from the father, and that the mother is kind of owned by the father, is something which gets re-dramatized in this weird situation.
There's a really interesting formulation, what Freud says about this kind of like serial lover, that Freud says that psychoanalysis teaches that when there is inactive in unconscious the notion of something irreplaceable, something that cannot be replaced, this kind of type of notion in the unconscious, this appears as a kind of like a broken cycle of endless like series of formations that always dissatisfy. I think that he's hitting on something really deep there, but he's connecting this with this really like speculative thesis to his analysis of how love relations function. But there is this idea that every like surrogates, every kind of object of desire, so in a way fails already. Isn't this kind of like analysis of desire itself? Like desire is always a failed experience.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, I cannot resist in making a comparison between this psychoanalytic model with the Oedip complex and another triangle from transactional analysis, where one is the saver, the other is the victim, and the third is the victim, the saver, and the persecutor.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, the solution is that they become adults.
Mm-hmm.
So getting out from these roles. And because Dimitri asked who is suffering, I think it depends to whom do you identify with. Because if I identify with a woman, with a mother, then the mother suffers. Or, okay, Freud, he has a little misogyn approach from a man perspective, but you can play the role of the father by being the child, by being the son, or the other way. So it depends on you and on the process of identification with one of these roles, I think. Also, what do you think?
I think that there's on my first reflection, there's a ton of synergy here between the model of savior, victim, and persecutor, and the solution being to become adults. I think ultimately it's Freud saying the same thing and just with different terminology, because the solution to this weird love triangle is that the man sort of becomes sort of aware of this wish to be the father, which is to become an adult in some sense. And the triangle of savior, victim, persecutor does seem to overlap very nicely with this idea that there's an injured third party and that there's someone who, as it were, needs to save someone, and that the person who needs to be saved from her own sort of potentially devilish nature. So it does have this same structure. So I mean, I see it as potentially synergistic. That would be my feeling.
Okay, and I want to say that these roles are interchangeable. They change all the time.
Yeah, and it's interesting, it's interesting, I would say, like, to situate these weird triangles in the modern dating landscape where people are, as like Esther Perel would say, serial monogamous now, and how people are delaying growing up longer and longer and longer, and how people are finding themselves in more and more ambiguous relationships which aren't in the clear categories of we're monogamous, or like Dan Savage would say, we're monogamish type of thing. So so these types of weird dating landscape where the old rules are off type of thing, I think it would be interesting to see it to what extent these weird neurotic love triangles manifest in all sorts of weird situations. I mean, I've encountered these weird situations for sure.
Does this has to do with also delaying the castration, the process
Right.
of castration?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, delaying. Yeah. I mean, I would say it does have some relation to the discovery of and the acceptance of castration. Like it's hard to first, like, I would say in my own consciousness, at first I didn't know about the logic of castration, and I would act as if I were the man, you know, in a type of strong identity, I'm the man. Then you sort of discover castration, and then you struggle with accepting it, of coming to terms with the fact that you are not the thing, and yet you still kind of need to become the thing. So you have this impossibility, and how this impossibility becomes enacted in one's own love life is you know, confusing to say the least.
Would you say that you find in your own view the type of list that Freud gives? I mean, it's a list of, he says in a Kantian manner that it's the conditions of possibility of choosing a love object. So he's saying that there are these few conditions which have to be in place for love to be possible, in a sense. So the first one is that there has to be some kind of injured third party, and then there has to be some kind of like questionable sexual reputation and so on.
Well, I can say, I can tell an interesting story of how this manifested. I think this manifests in men and women. You know, and maybe that's more to the level that Alexandra was pointing towards, of the interchangeability of these roles. But the general condition of possibility in the neurotic love object that I've observed is that the love object needs to be something that in principle you can't have.
Yeah.
Once you know you can't have it, then you love it because you know that you'll never actually be united. So you get to keep this impossible object at a distance.
Yeah.
And so this is the mechanism by which one, as it were, delays accepting castration, I think.
But there seems
and I think it manifests in men and women. I see a lot of women. I see women who behave like this, where, like, and I've had situations where women, like the women who have attached to me the strongest are the women who know they can't have me. And that the same thing has happened to me in the opposite way.
I think that this is something that the pickup artists are exploiting in a genius manner. They recognize and they teach it and so on. It's quite ingenious in a sense. But I think that there is something of a deeper value going on, since Freud is recognizing, and this I think goes straight into a Freudian like approach, that in our own like ordinary conscious life, we would say that we love somebody who is like morally unreproachable, somebody who's a virgin, let's say, just a pure like. But in a way, we have to recognize that in the way that we choose love objects, it's not that kind of like the moral view of the love object is, it's not that it never goes that way. We do not get interested into loving somebody who is morally pure, but we have to see some kind of like darker side or I mean, I'm thinking that why is slutty dressing so common for girls who try to be attractive? What, I mean, a naive question. Why is slutty dressing attractive? Well, isn't this kind of like evidence for the kind of view that Freud is giving, that we do not get interested in anybody if they are not giving us some kind of like slutty aspect or some kind of like promiscuous aspect also. It's really like counterintuitive to our morally like conditioned way of looking at things.
Mm-hmm. I think the sluttiness as being so attractive is because it forces one's mind to this paradox of the split, which has already happened between the mother with the virgin and the prostitute, because you imagine the mother as like your object who couldn't possibly have intimacy with another man, and then you realize that the mother must have had intimacy with another man.
Yeah.
And so then you have the split, and so the dressing provocatively magnifies the paradox and brings it to you and has no resolution and so forth. So
yeah.
Also because, like, for example, even take, for example, like the proliferation of online sluttiness, you might say, like on Instagram or OnlyFans or something like that, where you have explicitly women who are getting attention from millions of men. So it's the ultimate impossibility right in your face.
Yeah, and Freud said somewhere, I think really geniusly, that psychoanalysis shows that when we have in our conscious life two terms that are completely opposed, in the unconscious they are united.
Yeah.
Isn't also Christianity the repression of the prostitute mother, the Virgin Mary? It sounds so much like just repression of this.
Absolutely.
Definitely, yeah.
That Jesus's mother was born a virgin, like that he was born a virgin. This is like the interesting thing that Freud's saying, is that the unconscious is something that's universal in our mythologies, in our stories, in our folklore, in our religions. But the only thing is that with psychoanalysis is that we're just making this more conscious. We're just becoming conscious of ourselves.
And if there were to be a completely divine man, I mean, it would have to be a madman. Jesus is a madman, but then he would have to be conceived from like, there would have to be no impurity in terms of sexuality in the upbringing.
Yeah,
that's also interesting that Jesus is, of course, Jesus is not the father we aspire to be in Christianity.
No, yeah, he's saying that he's bringing the sword. When you love your father and mother, then you don't love Jesus. That's the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're loving this. You're loving this singularity of madness.
Madness of divinity, perhaps. Itself.
Madness of divine love. Yeah. It's fascinating. And so one of the things I'm always skeptical of is this temptation among New Age spiritualists to find Jesus's secret lover, like that Jesus did like Jesus was having sex. And we can find out Jesus was having sex, and you know what it is? You know what they're doing with it? It's that they want to have sex, and they want to justify their having sex with Jesus actually also had sex.
That's fine. Isn't there this kind of like joke also of Jesus, like, I mean, I'm going to bungle up this joke, but I mean, Jesus goes to Mary Magdalene, who is seducing Jesus to fuck him, but I fuck her. But then Jesus undresses her and sees the like lack there. Oh my God, this needs to be fixed. And then
well, this joke is in I think this joke is in Zizek's book on jokes, where Mary goes to seduce Jesus, and when she opens her legs, he thinks it's a wound and he tries to heal it.
That's that's a wound. Yeah.
And I have to say, I have to admit that while there's nothing that's more beautiful to me than a woman's body, in some sense, the vagina is actually something I find quite terrifying. Even something disturbing. So yeah, it's really, really, really interesting. Again, we get the coincidence of the opposites here between, you know, the absolute as something that can be simultaneously, I think, Dimitri, you mentioned this, the absolute can be something that's simultaneously cringeworthy and disgusting, and at the same time attractive and beautiful, and it's at the same time somehow.
I have a question about this kind of. So becoming aware of this triangle we as men are in, because it's very focused on male development, of course. To become conscious of this is to become more of an adult, and simultaneously to become conscious of this is to become more of a father, in a sense. So what is an adult even? Is that a normal human who is not neurotic? So this is another substantiality, which is like forever out of reach. I will never be an adult because it's an undivided subject. Or
well, no.
What are we trying to do here?
What I think Freud's describing as a quote unquote normal adult is basically an adult that has accepted castration and that does the impossible almost as if it's his normal or her normal behavior. So like to be a father or to be a mother is in some sense an impossible task, and yet fathers and mothers do it as if it's their natural being.
Could one also say that a parent is somebody who is decentered in the Lacanian sense?
Yeah, accepts being decentered.
Yeah, so they sustain this kind of decentering and keep on their life, like in the like ordinary sense. I would say they go to work, they bring food to the table, and they provide for children and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
it's not the personal like dream. I have this dream of becoming whatever the fuck people dream about these days.
Yeah.
It's not this personal like my satisfaction is the essence or something like that.
Yeah, I think I said this in a podcast with Aaron Rogerson, but it's like this story it's an Aesop fable of a toad saying to a centipede, I watch you every morning walking with your 100 legs, but I have to ask you, how do you do it? And then the centipede says, actually, I've never thought about it before, but now that you're making me think about it, I'm having trouble walking. So there's this idea that becoming aware of how difficult it is to, for example, become a father. It's like people in the past just did it. They didn't think about it. Like you didn't think about becoming a father. You just became a father. And then you were a father. And that's just what you are. Whereas now today we're becoming more conscious of our unconscious. And it's almost like we have to become aware that we are going to become fathers. And to think about it makes it impossible. It's like, now that I'm thinking about becoming a father, it's like, how the hell do I do that? You know, but my dad just became a father and it was just a catastrophe.
Yeah, it usually is. Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. I dedicated my PhD thesis to him, so it's somehow reconciliation.
Excuse me, do you think that all these structures, psychoanalytical structures we were discussing about, they are primary ontological structures, or they depend on the culture we live in? Because, for instance, I would be interested if, for instance, this in vitro fertilization with the surrogate mothers, or the pill, or the abortion, or for the fathers, this test of paternity, which is every time possible now, to know who the father is. So all these science mediated methods that changed motherhood in a way, and fatherhood. Do you think this can influence or not, or these are ontological structures, psychoanalytic?
Well, I guess my first response would be that the division between are these primary or do they depend on culture is kind of itself a problematic distinction, because like I think they can be ontological and cultural at the same time, and they can be ontological and also historically conditioned at the same time. So namely that they might reflect the ontology of a certain historical being, but that historical being itself may change. And so, for example, with 20th century, with the pill, with abortion, with surrogate mothers, with in vitro fertilization, with all the things you mentioned, and think about all the things that might emerge in the 21st century. So everything could change. And that wouldn't mean that these psychoanalytic structures are not ontological. It just means that ontology is incomplete. It would mean ontology is a becoming.
I was also going to point out that the same. That I was going to ask that isn't it both?
It's both.
Like it's both at the same time.
Absolutely, it's both and.
Yeah. So there is culture. There is like things. There exists the kind of structure which conditions the way that we can conceptualize experience itself. There has to be some kind of like structure. This is the Kantian like how could I say rupture in philosophical thinking overall, that there has to be some type of transcendental structure the way to the way that we can conceptualize experience, but that this structure cannot be something that exists non-historically, so to say. They have to develop somehow into us. So this is bringing a paradox in a sense.
Yes.
Since how can it be that this structure conditions the way that we conceptualize experience, since it's the very ground from which we conceptualize experience itself? It's a difficult problem, but yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that, yeah, with Kant, like bringing in Kant here and transcendental structure, it's like, it's we always presuppose that the ontology has to be some sort of unchanging absolute being. And I think that the fact that something can be the absolute being and also be a becoming at the same time is what emerges in Hegel's dialectic.
Definitely, yes.
So it has to be kind of sort of to say, and that's a weird position for psychoanalysis. And I think that it might be what creates a lot of tension with science, because the psychoanalytic object is a self-reflective object where the ontology and the epistemology are kind of co-entangled. You know, like, and I think that ultimately science has to confront the same problem with things like genetic engineering, because it's not merely that we observe biology and understand biology as some absolute being in itself, but now that we can genetically engineer biology, what is biology depends on our own knowledge structures. So we can manipulate the genetic code, or what if we could actually manipulate atomic structure? Like, there's many different physicists who are interested in atomic manufacturing. So I think with psychoanalysis, we're just merely encountering a way to approach knowledge where the being of a thing and our knowledge of a thing are correlated.
Does this mean that maybe non-dual philosophies, non-dual phenomenology can be more appropriate to psychoanalysis because it's about this non-duality?
Well, to me, so non-duality is this, like the transcendental experience of oneness. Like, could be a psychedelic experience. It could be the experience in a meditation, in like a deep non-egoic state of consciousness. But to me, psychoanalysis is much more in this paradox, the paradox of dualism, like, or I would call it non-monism, like the fact that things want to be one, but things struggle to be one. Like look at man and woman, like in a deep love, or just not even man and woman, just deep love between two people. Like, you deeply want to be one, and in some sense you are one, but at the same time you're two. And
would the paradox also be, if we try to bring in the kind of concept of non-duality, well, isn't the paradox that we have to explain non-duality?
As soon as we speak about non-duality, I think non-duality makes no sense.
Yeah. And we may experience some kind of like non-duality, but it presupposes some kind of ground.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of philosophical insight which I think Freud operates more than in the approach to trying to bring about the type of unification with the non-dual state of some. I mean, this is the project that I think the kind of spiritualistic, in the cheaper sense than in the Freudian Hegelian sense of spirit, Christ, the kind of cheaper spiritual perspective is trying to bring about the union with the original state, or with the life force of everything that exists, and so on. I mean, perhaps the more fashionable term is energy or something like this. But something that they forget always is that there has to be some kind of explanation for it, and they try to bring it about. It always fails, and it's almost like this childish, insatiable urge to ask questions. I mean, if you have been around children, it's just this urge of making up sentences that are brought up to the parents as mysteries, and parents have to constantly keep on answering them.
Yeah.
Also, isn't it that, so non-duality is obviously a response to duality, and then you have duality and non-duality. So isn't that a duality in itself?
I think that's an interesting paradox as well, which is that,
binary also.
I think exactly. I think that I had this experience with a few Deleuzians, because I was teaching a course on dialectical thinking, and I was teaching about whatever, like dialectics of Plato, dialectics of Hegel, and then immediately a Deleuzian in the audience said, "Oh, but what about the Deleuzian model of multiplicity and stuff?" And then I was like, "Well, I'm teaching dialectics, and Deleuze is anti-dialectical, so why would I talk about Deleuze if he's anti-dialectical?" And then immediately I pointed out that you were proposing a type of dialectic between dialectics and non-dialectics. So it's the same thing with the non-dualist. Like, you're proposing a non-duality in relation to duality, which is itself a duality. It's the same paradox that emerges. And it's this, I think deep down, it's the pain of historicity. The pain of historicity is too much to bear, so it would be easier to imagine a non-dual state, or easier to imagine a pure multiplicity.
So historicity,
this might sound quite banal,
like limitation by temporality.
Sorry?
Like the limitation imposed by temporality is what you mean by the pain of history.
Yes, the pain of history, the pain of temporality. Like, there's so many people, I think, who are like, whenever someone says time does not exist, I'm always thinking this person must be in enormous pain.
That's great. I was going to bring up in this connection also how Aristotle, Aristotle distinguishes between the natural scientist and dialectician. The natural scientist, when defining anger or fear, refers to the blood boiling around the heart, the nerves, and so on. But the dialectician would give the aim that the person have, or the intention, and the way that the person experiences oneself in conflict with others. But Aristotle also says that dialectics is limited because it cannot achieve knowledge of causes. And I think that this kind of like gesture of saying that dialectics is limited, since it doesn't concern the causes of experience or the causes of reality and so on, I think that this does bring out some kind of limitation to dialectics also.
Absolutely. And that's not to say that there's not some sort of non-dialectical core that's worth exploring and going into. I think that I think that post-Hegelian philosophy does identify that problem. But the risk is, and this is, I think, a developmental educational risk, is that going to the non-dialectical before one has first processed dialectically is a potential trap of the development of the intellect. That it's worth it to go through a dialectical process before one reaches a non-dialectical core of, in Zizek, this comes up in the chapter on the limits of Hegel. So it's worth going into that deeper.
Yeah. I think that Hegel would recognize the idea of there being some kind of like non-dialectical structures that
and Heidegger does as well, by the way.
Huh?
Heidegger does as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, very interesting. I know Zizek would probably relate it to like a type of Dmitry. I think you sent me a video on Zizek about cosmology. And I think Zizek identified in this video on cosmology type of the non-dialectical, like absolute negativity, as like something that's not historically mediated, but rather something that I don't know if it's right to say trans-historical, but points in that direction.
Another word for the absolute difference, which precedes everything.
Yes.
What Barth calls mobilism, or atheos, perhaps.
Okay. All right, guys.
Yeah,
so if there's anything anyone wants to say
but definitely Freud, just to connect and bring the topic like full circle. Definitely, Freud does recognize the figure of mother as some type of transcendental presupposition for experience. I think that Freud is onto something, like he's bringing certain type of genesis of experience and consciousness in a way that's really innovative, and there's nothing like in philosophy before him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And it's so interesting that it didn't appear before, because once it clicks, it's like, that's such a interesting model of the mind, and such an interesting model of, like, it's interesting that philosophers didn't consider the way in which their own genesis in a womb played some role in their thinking.
Yeah, isn't this in this paper where he's saying that the very origin of anxiety itself is in birth? That's genius, I think. Like if you think of why we are doing, why am I speaking, everything relates to anxiety. The very thing that propels action forward. Everything relates to birth. I mean, isn't that like really obvious. Why didn't somebody like Aristotle think of that?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So just to wrap up, if there's anything anyone wants to say and maybe a closing thought about these papers, feel free. Otherwise, I'm going to do a little summary and then we'll close out. But just to sort of summarize for those listening after the fact, you know, we first covered family romances, covered the feeling of intense idealization as it relates to the father and the mother, the hostility towards the father, the feeling of faithlessness in the mother, and that these intense problems of idealization have a lot to do with the way in which we romanticize our own origin and sort of have an unconscious memory of our earliest experiences with older parental figures. And then also explored similar themes in a second paper titled A Special Type of Choice of Object Made by Men, where many neurotic men find themselves in these impossible love triangles where they're trying to ultimately reclaim some experience that they had before the fall from the mother, you might say. I want to also add that this idea and these papers are connected to another series of papers on the psychology of love, which I anticipate we'll be covering in the next workshop. So I invite you all to join me in the next workshop. I'll send out an invite in the next 2 weeks. And other than that, I just thank you all for your presence, your time, your comments, your questions. And I really felt like this was a nice extended conversation on these papers. So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you. And
Thank you.
Good luck with the whole situation and everything.
Yeah.
I hope you take care.
Thank you.
Life and death. See you guys.
Very Freudian.
See you. Bye bye.